Thank you, Doug. We have time for a few questions, so you'll have to shout them out. So, Doug?
I like being shouted at. Yes.
Mr. Saunders, if I'm not mistaken, you wrote an article that thought government become a fortress. Was that yours? Seems to be a picture when the Parliament was shut up.
Oh, yes, yes.
So the idea of not, and you conceded that in Canada that there's a lot of kind of high rises and so on. So I suppose I wanted you to address the general manager here pointed out the library across the street was the third provincial budget, the third federal, and the third city. So that's a brilliant model and the exception. But things like, let's say, access to justice or something where access is earmarked for, let's say, legal aid, but it's not delivered to. Have you encountered in various cities or in Canada an impediment of directing, again, funds or energies to address the problems that come with a growing population that's not all from the same place?
Yes, I should say in Canada, generally, municipal governments have been more enlightened than in other places, certainly than in Europe. In Canada, you have the problem, and in a lot of other places you do, that our cities are divided among administrations. And the places where the new poor immigrants are arriving are not the places that they used to be. And there's been a very slow ramping up of realization in these places. Now, I would say Vancouver is already sort of a generation ahead of that. I'd say Surrey and Richmond have long since realized that this is an important part of their identity and their role, and therefore should be of their institutional structure. Toronto had a bit of a shock because it was never really amalgamated enough. It remains a patchwork quilt of municipalities. And you get this paradox in cities that haven't amalgamated very far, have not turned into larger where the municipal government doesn't cover the entire economic area, let's say, like New York City did 100 years ago when it brought Queens and Long Island into its single government, or like London did in 2000. When you don't have that, you have this problem that the places in the suburbs where new immigrants are arriving are used to playing an economic game where they have competed with the inner cities for tax base, for mill rate, particularly for business taxes. And they're able to charge much lower property tax rate. They were in the past because they did not have to offer the social services that were very expensive. They did not have to offer the sort of public transportation. And so on, because generally people, those who were poor or in need or drug addicts or something like that would go downtown and deal with that there. Those who couldn't afford a car would go downtown and live there. So you had very high tax rates downtown, and the places around the suburbs could charge very low tax rates. And this created some real problems. Now I should say in the Toronto case, if Vancouver's outer areas are a generation ahead in getting past this, Toronto's are half a generation still. But I think there's an understanding, at least now, among the people who run Peel region, which is the Mississauga and so on, the largest immigrant landing pad in Canada, if not North America, that is what they are now. There is a better understanding of that now. And it's not all just a dynamic of tax rate competition. There's an understanding of the need for some public transportation, certainly for social services, certainly for the more flexible forms of development and zoning that allow for immigrant success. But this is the typical problem in places, is that there is consciousness, but the consciousness of the needs of these communities is often, among governments, is often no longer in the places where these people are arriving, right? Yes, sir. Yeah, and what this gentleman's referring to is the political consequence of this new pattern. Now that almost all immigration and most urban poverty are located in the suburbs, you get an interesting political situation. And yes, Toronto has become very famous for this, although Vancouver follows exactly the same pattern, which is that if you look at the results of the Toronto election, it's funny, being able to discuss a Toronto election and having most people actually understand what I'm talking about is this is perhaps the only time in my life, and hopefully will be the last time in my life, that people will know what happened. But the people who voted for John Tory, who won the election as mayor, and for Olivia Chow, his left-wing challenger, all basically lived in the same place, which was the central core, as you say, inverted T-shaped. And let's say they were a much higher income level, and the people who voted for Chow and Tory were in districts that were 84% white-skinned people. The people who voted for Doug Ford almost all lived in the districts that voted for Doug Ford were around that suburban donut, much lower income, and were in places that were 34% people with white skin. In other words, the minority, often immigrant, poor service economy people voted for the populist candidate, and you had a central city that voted for the elite candidate. And therefore, you still have a political divide, and so on. And of course, it never follows the patterns people think it will, right? I mean, the candidate who is from an immigrant background and campaigned on it did the worst, because I think Canadians from migrant backgrounds sort of have a political sensibility where the idea that I'm going to vote for somebody who's like me doesn't apply anymore. People are more politically mature in that sense. I would say there was not an illogic, but it was an outsider vote. And I think you see that divide in Vancouver, where the lower income service industry workers tend to live in Richmond and Surrey and have political views that are very different from the more elite left-wing and right-wing people who live in the more central areas and so on. You see a similar divide in Montreal emerging as well, and so on. So yeah, the politics of this are very interesting. I think we've seen a recognition by conservative governments in Canada and Britain, and now to a great extent in Germany, that the people who live in the arrival city districts can vote for conservative parties. Certainly, Canada's conservatives have made great hay of this with great success. In Britain, there's a tilt of the balance between a desire to become the party of diversity and immigration, and a desire to get votes back from the anti-immigrant party. So you don't get that. But in Germany, in the last election, we saw Angela Merkel's Christian Democrats make a huge bid to try to get the Turkish-German vote onto their side, because it's now enough people that it counts, much as it does in those places, and to speak of the urban districts in which they live, to speak of offering dual citizenship and things like this, and out of a recognition that poor immigrant districts could become natural voters for conservative parties because they are small business people, they are often more religious than the general population, and so on. They have a lot of the characteristics that could appeal. So there's an interesting political battleground in the immigrant districts of Europe and North America right now, as conservative parties start saying, okay, let's stop being anti-diversity, let's start realizing that these people could be our core constituency.
One more. Mr. Saunders, excuse me, you touched briefly on the importance of education in creating successful rival cities. In your opinion, is Canada's public education system up to the task of accommodating the large numbers of immigrants we're receiving? If not, what kind of changes?
Well, it's better than some. One of the big problems is there's no such thing as Canada's public education system. Our country was crippled at birth by a constitution that divided these things among 10 different administrative jurisdictions. And so unlike, say, Britain or Germany, where you see education policy stories on the front page of the national newspapers every day, you never do in Canada, because there's 10 different sets of stories and so on, and 10 very different systems. That said, the English-speaking countries of the world of the Western world tend to have a better understanding of the needs of new communities, and an understanding that keeping people in school is important than other places do. This wasn't true a generation ago. The biggest risk in immigrant neighborhoods, I think, is of the male offspring, the male children of the initial immigrants dropping out of secondary education at an early age. Maybe this won't be true in the next generations, but in the generations who arrived during the last 30 years or so, this is a huge problem. Partly because it's people who arrived out of industrial employment, where it made sense to be dropping out of school early and getting a factory job and that sort of thing. Partly, though, because in many places, the schools were providing incentives for people to get out of the schools. And we see that in places that had a strict streaming system, where people are, or selective education, where people are selected at age 11 or 12 or something to go into a technical stream or a university-bound stream, which worked fine for well-integrated native-born populations, but for people who are still in the process of integrating, which generally happens while you're in secondary school, it can be dire. A lot of them practice what's called the cascade system, where if you do poorly in one grade, you're held back and you repeat that grade, which again, ticked along okay for homogeneous populations, but where you have populations of newcomers, suddenly you're not advancing with your peer group and you've got a bunch of strangers in your class and you have the humiliation of being put back, it's an incentive to drop out of school. And you have problems with schools that teach at one education level in each class. I'd say a lot of Canadian school systems have understood that it makes more sense to have more than one teacher in each class, teaching at various different education levels in parallel. Certainly the British schools that my kids went to understood that. They had 2 or 3 teachers in each class teaching at various different education levels so the kids could progress there. I mean, it's not true that kids who arrive not speaking English hinder the education system. In fact, there's quite a bit of research now that suggests that being in a school with a lot of kids who don't arrive speaking English or whatever the native language is, mixed with kids who do, is not just good for the kids who don't, but the kids who do speak English actually have better educational success in those schools than they do in schools where everybody speaks the language fine. And so on. Being in a school with a lot of new immigrants in it where the languages are spoken, it can be expensive for the educational system because you do need to have more teaching resources. But it actually, for the outcomes of both the fluent students and the English as a second language students, it actually produces better outcomes for both groups. So I would say a lot of Canadian education systems understand that and realize that providing incentives to keep people in school works. But it's a mixed bag. It really, really varies across Canada, right? It's the most important thing because there's been a lot of studying of the word integration gets used a lot, and it means a lot of things to a lot of different people. But if we're to understand integration as basically meaning fitting in well enough with the system that you're accepted and so on, everything we've seen shows that if your family becomes educationally integrated, which is to say that your family is getting basically the same number of years of education as the average people around you, and economically integrated, which means that you're getting roughly the same level of employment and pay as people around you, then the cultural stuff takes care of itself, right? Groups that attain the same education and income levels as the native-born population never have cultural problems. Whatever cultural differences they have suddenly become seen as virtuous or become cooperative and colorful rather than as being threatening and so on. It's when people talk of integration failures, it's usually at root a failure of educational and employment integration. So these things are very important in these places, and a small investment up front can create a much larger outcome out back. I mean, we should know that because we've been through 150 years of it and so on. Somehow most of our ancestors got through that. Usually had great difficulty in the first couple generations, right? I mean, if you look at what was happening in the early 20th century in Canada, a lot of people were arriving from Europe illiterate, and their kids were even more illiterate than they were. You had the same second generation problem where the second generation doesn't try as hard among Southern European, Mediterranean people, among Eastern Europeans, among even people from the British Isles and so on. A lot of the patterns that the newest groups are experiencing, we've seen over and over again over the last 150 years with people who now think it was easy. Our memory tends to compress things. We think, oh, my people got off the boat and yada yada, and then we were in university and we owned a house in the suburbs and so on. And that yada yada often covers 2 generations of difficulty, of slipping back, of oh my God, my kids joined a gang, of all that sort of stuff. So we need to learn from our successes, and we also need to avoid our mistakes.
Okay, Doug, thank you very much.
And that's a good concluding lesson. Thank you very much.